Hello student, welcome to Biopsychology 1 class, and my name is Satwika and I am your lecturer for this class. Before we dive more into this course, let's talk about the introduction part first. So, in this module, I will talk about the biological approach to behavior and the biological explanation of the behavior, some career opportunities in global world related to biopsychology, and the use of animals in research at a glance. After studying this introduction part, you should be able to state the mind-brain problem and contrast between monism and dualism. And you can list 3 general points that are important to remember from this text. 3, give example of physiological, ontogenetic, evolutionary, and functional explanation of behavior. And the last one, you should be able to discuss the ethical issues of research with laboratory animals. All right. Let's begin with the lifetime question about the mind-brain or the mind-body problem. The question of how minds relate to brain activities. Think about this. Given a universe composed of matter and energy, why is there such a thing as consciousness? We can imagine how matter come together to form molecules and how certain kinds of carbon compounds came together to form a primitive type of life, which tend to evolve into animals with brains and complex behavior. But why are certain types of brain activity conscious? So far, no one has offered a convincing explanation of consciousness. A few scholars have suggested that we abandon the concept of consciousness altogether, and that proposals avoid the question, actually, rather than answering it. And consciousness is something we experience, and it calls for an explanation, of course, even if we do not yet see how to explain it. So we regard consciousness as a fundamental property of matter, that cannot be reduced to something else, for example, mass and electrical charge are fundamental properties. So maybe consciousness is like that. However, that is an unsatisfying answer. To say that consciousness is a fundamental property would mean that we have given up on explaining it. So certainly it is too soon to give up. After we learn as much as possible about the nervous system, perhaps we shall understand what consciousness is all about. Even if not, the research in this area will teach us much that is important and interesting. So biological psychology is the study of the physiological, evolutionary, and developmental mechanism of behavior and experience. It is approximately synonymous with the term of biopsychology. So in this class, we use the term of biopsychology or the psychobiology or physiological psychology and behavioral neuroscience. So the term biological psychology emphasizes that the goal is to relate biology to issues of psychology. Neuroscience here includes much that is relevant to behavior, but also includes more detail about anatomy and chemistry. So biological psychology is not only a field of study, but also a point of view. It holds that we think and act as we do because of brain mechanism, and that we evolve those brain mechanisms because ancient animals built this way, survived, and reproduced. So biological psychology deals mostly with brain activity. We can see from the images here, offers a view of the human brain from the top, what anatomists call a dorsal view, and from the bottom, yeah, or a ventral view. And the labels point to a few important areas that will become more familiar as you proceed through this course. And inspection of a brain reveals distinct sub-areas that we will learn in the following courses. And at the microscopic levels here, we find two kinds of cells, the neurons and the glia. Okay, so we will discuss it later on the next class about neuron and glia. Why we should learn about biopsychology? So if you enter career in psychology, yeah, you might continue using a great deal of information from biopsychology course. Otherwise, you will inevitably forget many of the facts. Also, you will occasionally read about a new research study that refresh your memory. Regardless of how many details you remember, at least 3 general points here should stick with you forever from this course. So the first one, the perception occurs in your brain. So when something contacts your hand, the hand sends a message to your brain. You feel it in your brain, not in your hand, actually. So the electrical stimulation of your brain could produce a hand experience, even if you had no hand. Okay? And hand disconnected from your brain has no experience. And the second one, mental activities and certain types of brain activities are inseparable. This position is known as monism. Yeah. So the inseparable one is monism, or the idea that the universe consists of only one type of being. And the opposite is the dualism, is the idea that minds are one type of substance and matter is another. Nearly all neuroscientists and philosophers supports the position of monism. And you should understand monism and the evidence behind it. It is not easy to get used to the concept of monism. According to monism, your thoughts or your experience are the same thing as your brain activity. People sometimes ask whether brain activity causes thoughts or whether thoughts direct the brain activity. What do you think? According to monism, that question is like asking whether the temperature causes the movement of molecules or whether the movement of molecules causes the temperature. Neither causes the other way. There are just different ways of describing the same thing, actually. And the last one, the third one, we should be cautious about what is an explanation is what is not. Yeah, this means is, for example, people with depression have less than usual activities in certain brain areas. The question is, does that evidence tells us why people became depressed? Actually, no, it doesn't. To illustrate, consider that people with depression also have less activity than normal in their legs. So they don't move around as much as other people do. Clearly, the inactive legs did not cause depression. Suppose we also find the certain genes that are less common than average among people with depression. Does that genetic difference explain depression? Again, it does not. It might be useful step forward explaining the depression after we understand what those genes do, but the genetic difference itself does not explain anything. In short, we should avoid overstating the conclusion from any research study. All right, so common sense explanation of behavior, yeah, that we found out there often refer to intentional goals, such as he did this because he was trying to blah, 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 or she did that because she wanted to blah, blah, blah. But often we have no reason to assume intention, right? So for example, a 4-month-old bird migrating south for the first time presumably does not know why. And the next spring, the bird, when she lays an egg, sit on it, and then defends it from predators, again, she doesn't know why. Even humans don't always know the reason for their own behavior. Let me ask, yawning or laughter are two examples of that. You do them, but can you explain what they accomplish? Intention are, at best, a weak form of explanation. Yeah. So in contrast to common sense explanation, biological explanation of behavior fall into four categories here. There are physiological explanation, ontogenetic, evolutionary, and functional explanation. So let's see the first one, the physiological explanation. It relates a behavior to the activity of the brain and other organs. It deals with the machinery of the body, actually. So for example, the chemical reaction that enables hormone to influence the brain activity and the routes by which brain activity controls the muscle contraction. So that is the physiological explain. Yeah, you can see the example from this table. So the next one is the ontogenetic explanation. This term comes from Greek roots, meaning the origin or genesis of being. An ontogenetic explanation describes how a structure or behavior develops, yeah, including the influences of the genes, nutrition, experience, and their interactions. Yeah, for example, males and females differs on average in several ways. Some of those differences can be can be traced to the effects of genes or prenatal hormones, yeah. And some relate to cultural influences, and many would relate partly to both the genes or the cultural influences. And some awaits for further research, absolutely. The third one is the evolutionary explanation. So evolutionary explanation reconstruct the evolutionary history of a structure or behavior. So we see from the past, the characteristic features of an animal are almost always modification of something found in ancestral species. For example, batwing, yeah, they modified their arms, and porcupines, the porcupine quills, they are modified hairs, okay? So in behavior, monkeys use tools occasionally, and human evolve elaboration on those abilities that enable us to use tools even better than monkey. So evolutionary explanation call attention to behavioral similarities among related species. And lastly, the functional explanation here. So it describes why a structure or behavior evolved as it did. Yeah, within a small isolated population, a gene can spread by accident through a process called genetic drift. So for example, a dominant male with many offspring spreads all his genes, including some that may have been irrelevant to his success or even disadvantages. However, a gene that is prevalent in a large population probably provided some advantage, at least in the past, though not necessarily today. A functional explanation identifies that advantage. For example, many species have an appearance that matches their background. So that's the example of functional explanation. Appearance that match their background is become a camouflage appearance, makes the animal inconspicuous to predator, of course. And some of the species use their behavior as part of camouflage, yeah. So for example, hawks that native to Mexico and the southern part of United States fly among vultures and hold their wings in the same posture as vultures. And Small mammals and birds run for cover when they see a hawk, but they learn to ignore vultures, which pose no threat to healthy animals. Because the zone-tailed hawks resemble vultures in both appearance and flight behavior, their prey disregard them, enabling the hawks to pick up easy meals. So yeah, that's the example of functional explanation. All right, let's move to the career opportunities. Why we should learn biopsychology, and let's see what the opportunities out there, yeah, globally. So if you want to consider a career related to biological psychology or biopsychology, you have a range of options relating to research and therapy. Yeah, so if you want to continue your study after you graduated from the bachelor degree, a research position, yeah, ordinarily requires a PhD in psychology, biology, neuroscience, and other related fields. So if you want to be a researcher, then you might continue your study, your bachelor degree into master degree and then PhD. In a research laboratory, yeah, people with a master or bachelor degree might work there in laboratory. So for example, in this faculty laboratory, the mind, brain, and behavior laboratory, you may work there as an assistant because you have, or you're pursuing your bachelor degree, you can work as an assistant, but will not direct the laboratory. You need a PhD to be able to be a director of a laboratory. Yeah, and many people with PhD hold college or university position. Yeah, so when they perform some combination of teaching and research, yeah, others have pure research position in laboratories. Yeah, and fields of therapy include clinical psychology, counseling psychology, or school psychology, medicine and allied medical practice such as physical therapy. Yeah, this field actually ranges from neurologists to social workers and clinical psychologists. Yeah, they need to recognize possible signs of brain disorders so they can refer a client to a proper specialist. So anyone who pursue a career in research needs to stay up to date on new development by attending convention, consulting with colleagues, and reading research journal, blah, blah, blah. So, but if you are entering a field on the outskirts of neuroscience, such as clinical psychology or school psychology or counseling psychology, in that case, you probably don't want to wade through technical journal articles, yeah, but you do want to stay current on major development, at least enough to converse intelligently with medical college. All right. So I hope that after you learn this biopsychology course, some of you might develop interest in as a researcher in behavioral neuroscience and conduct valuable research for Indonesian context and be able to collaborate with international researchers out there. Sounds very interesting, right? All right, so given that most biological psychologists and neuroscientists are primarily interested in the human brain and human behavior, why do they study non-humans or the animals? Here are some 4 reasons. Yeah, even though in our faculty there are not much study of non-humans or using animals in our faculty, but this is kind of like promising in if you consider to continue education in abroad. Yeah, so you have to understand that for researcher, the underlying mechanism of behavior are similar across species and sometimes easier to study in a non-human species. Yeah, so it's less complex. So if you want to understand a complex machine, which is human, you might begin by examining a simpler machine or the animals. All right, and then we are interested in animals for their own sake. Yeah, humans are naturally curious, actually. We would love to know about life, if any, elsewhere in this universe, yeah, regardless of whether that knowledge might be useful. Similarly, we would like to understand how bats chase insect in the dark, for example. How birds find their way over unfamiliar territory when they migrate, for example. Okay, and then the next one is what we learned about animals sheds light on human evolution, of course. Yeah, this is kind of like a question that we still need to answer about the evolution. How did we come to be the way we are today? And how do we resemble chimpanzees and other primates? And how do we differ from them? Why and how did primates evolve larger brains than other species? Researchers approach such questions by comparing species. And the last one is the legal or ethical restriction prevent certain kinds of research on humans. Yeah, of course, for example, investigators insert electrodes into the brains of rats and other animals to determine the relationship between brain activity and behavior. They also inject chemicals, extract brain chemicals, yeah, and study the effect of brain damage. Uh, we cannot do that with human, of course, for the ethical issues, yeah, legal or ethical reasons for that. However, they also raise an ethical issues. If the research is unacceptable with human, is it acceptable with other species? If so, under what circumstances? Yeah, so there's a pros and cons actually in this area still. All right, so yeah, so the goal in this introduction has been to preview the kinds of questions biological psychologists hope to answer. Yeah, so in the next several chapters, we shall go through a great deal of technical information that of type you need to know before we can start applying it to question about why people do what they do and experience why they experience. So biological psychologists, yeah, that studying biopsychology is actually are ambitious because we're hoping to explain as much as possible of psychology in terms of brain processes, genes, and the like. So the guiding assumption is that the pattern of activity that occurs in your brain when you see something is your perception. So the pattern that occurs when you feel fear is your fear. This is not to say your brain physiology controls you. No, you don't say that. Or you control your brain. No, it's also not like that. But rather, your brain is you. All right. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you again in the next module.